up, guys? It is Chris back for Watch Chris. Today we have a very interesting video to go through. I have 10 watch brands I'm going to talk about. All of these watch brands have one thing in common. They are a sister brand to a higher end brand. Brands like Tudor. Rolex, obviously the higher end brand when we're talking about the relationship between Rolex and Tudor. However, I have 10 brands to go through. There really aren't that many brands out there that are sister brands to higher end brands. A lot of these are independent brands as well, which is kind of cool. So we have a really good list. Let's go through them and start with number 1. Before we get into number 1, I do want to mention that some people out there think of these brands as the redheaded stepchild to the more prestigious brand like the Rolex and Tudor relationship. I don't think in those terms for all of these brands. However, for some of them, I kind of agree. A lot of the brands that we're going to be talking about are kind of obscure. They're not really all that well known. And I'm actually going to start with one that is pretty unknown. And it's a sister brand to a very high-end watch company called Girard-Perregaux. If you're a fan of watches, you know who Girard-Perregaux are. They make some very high-end watches. Some of my favorites, of course, the Laureato, but I really love their World Timer. I've owned a number of their watches. They make very high-end watches that don't sell very well here in the United States. However, did you know that they have a sister brand? It's called Jean Daniel Richard. This is a brand that's been around for a very long time. They make some really cool watches, and a lot of their watches feature movements from Girard-Perregaux. A lot of their watches also echo some of the design DNA from Girard-Perregaux as well. One of my favorites from the brand is a dive style watch that's called the Chronoscope. It gets an inner rotating bezel. It's a dual crown, so there's a crown on the 9 o'clock position and the 3 o'clock position. One of those crowns, the 9 o'clock position, actually controls that inner rotating bezel. These sometimes have ETA movement. Sometimes they actually get an in-house movement from Girard-Perregaux. It depends on which model you're getting and what year. They also changed their name at some point, and I think they dropped the Jean in the beginning and just went with Daniel Richard, and that's really it. These are really cool watches. Some of them are very high-end watches that sell for next to nothing because they are no longer in business. Also, no one really even knew who they were. So that's why they sell for a very good price. Well, I mentioned them in the intro. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them because they are probably the most well-known sister brand to a higher-end luxury brand. Of course, I'm talking about Tudor, one of the most famous sister brands, both owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. Tudor make a lot of homages to Rolexes. However, they do get in-house movements. They're made by a third party. However, they are in-house movements to Tudor. And at this point, a lot of people actually prefer Tudor to Rolex. I see that happening with many of the videos that I make. And Tudor have made some original designs as well. I really love their Ranger, and I really love the North Flag. I think that's one of the best looking Rolex Tudor watches that money can buy. Very well made. They have that cachet because they are associated with Rolex, but at the same time, of course, they are not Rolex. In a lot of cases, people prefer Tudor over Rolex at this point. The next watch brand is a Japanese watch brand. And I'm not talking about Grand Seiko and Seiko, although we can talk about them a little later on in this video because there's really a few brands that are under the Seiko umbrella that sort of fall into these categories. However, the brand that we're talking about is Hajime Asaoka. It's a very high-end brand. They make very high-end watches that cost in the tens of thousands of dollars. They have a lot of inspiration from Art Deco design, and you can definitely see that in most of their watches. They, or the watchmaker Hajime, actually decided to come out with a lower-end brand, or a more affordable brand, using pedestrian movements that were Japanese-made. So Miyota 9000 series, and some Seiko movements like the NE88. A lot of their watches get some design DNA from their higher end sister brand. However, these watches cost in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, and a lot of times they actually sell for more on the secondary market because they are very popular. The brand that we're talking about is Krono Tokyo, and they come out with watches and they usually sell out pretty quickly. They don't make a ton of watches, and they all feature Japanese-made movements, Japanese-made cases. They are a Japanese brand and they love to highlight that, which I don't think is a bad thing, and you're getting a lot of DNA from that higher end brand that they're associated with, but you're getting it for a very, very good price. Some people do not like these watches. I originally did not really love the watches myself because they were using a Miyota 9000 series and charging in the $3,000 range. Now I kind of get it. However, they are still expensive for what you're getting, but I do see the appeal of these watches. The next watch brands that we're talking about are a Helsinki-based brand. One is Sarpaneva, the other is SUF or SUF, depending on what you want to call it. SUF is the sister brand, the less expensive brand. They use pedestrian movements. A lot of the time they're using a Sellita movement. Sometimes they've used Eterna movements, which is kind of cool in some of their dive watches and other watches, but usually they are a pedestrian movement. You're getting a pretty straightforward dial. They make field watches and they make dive watches. Their sister brand, Sarpaneva, make really high-end watches using some pedestrian movements as well, but they use a lot of different complicated designs and materials in their cases and of course their dials. Lots of lume, special art that adorn not only the dials but the cases as well. They're expensive, but they're not incredibly expensive. They're in that $10,000 to $20,000, sometimes $30,000, depending on what you're actually getting. They're less expensive watches, the SUFs. Those go for around $2,000. You can get a dive watch for them for around $4,000. They recently came out with those just a few weeks ago, actually, and they sell out pretty quickly. Really cool watches, really good looking watches. Very straightforward when you're talking about SUF. The Sarpanevas are a little bit more complicated. You don't see the design DNA all that much, except for their dive watch, which gets a little bit of that DNA in the case shape and that bezel. But other than that, you cannot really tell that they are Sarpaneva related, which is maybe a good thing for some, maybe a bad thing for others. I like both brands and I really like their dive watch. I would love to have one of those in my collection one day. The next brands that we're talking about on this list are MB&F, Max Buser and Friends, and the Mad Galleries. They came out with the Mad 1, which was powered by a very cheap movement, an 8 series Miyota movement. However, they put it into a really interesting case with a dial really on the side of the case. That's the way that you actually tell the time. It's 2 discs, cylindrical discs that sit on top of each other and basically line up to tell you the time. There's a large rotor on the top with lots of lume. You can see the movement. It's a battle axe, very similar to what you would get from an MB&F. And we all know that MB&Fs are very, very expensive. They start at the $65,000 price point, somewhere in that range, and go way up from there. So they're very, very high-end watches, very expensive. And what they wanted to do was offer some of that, a taste of that, for the people who supply them and the people who are fans of the brand but couldn't afford an MB&F. So they came out with the Mad 1. It originally came out in blue, then it came out in black and green. It's a little bit, just a taste of what MB&F offers for a very good price. Around $3,000 to $4,000, I think, is what they're charging now, which really isn't all that bad considering what actually goes into this watch and where they're actually made within the MB&F studios, which is pretty cool. The next brands on this list are really the brands that inspired me to make this video. It's Groenfeld and Groan. Groan was actually just recently announced by the Groenfeld brothers, the owners of Groenfeld. Now, if you're not familiar with Groenfeld, Groenfeld make very high-end watches. They are very expensive. They start at around $40,000, somewhere in that range. Their designs are very clean. Their dials are very legible and clean as well. Their movements are sourced by a third party, I believe. However, the finishing and the look of their movements are extremely high-end. If you go on their website, they are not accepting orders currently. So it's kind of strange that they would come out with a less expensive sister brand in the brand Groan, but they did. And what you're getting is actually a lot of DNA from the Groenfeld brand, from that bigger sister brand. You're getting a 38mm case that is very similar to one of their popular models. You're also getting a beautiful dial that has a couple of different layers, applied indices. You're getting a central portion of that dial that is textured. It is a stamped texture. However, it is really good looking. And you're actually getting a Groenfeld crown. They didn't do anything with the crown. They just gave you a Groenfeld crown, which is kind of funny. And powering this is a Sellita movement, an SW210. So you're getting a hand-wound movement, and they're saying they actually adjust it to make it feel the way that they want it to feel when you're winding it, because they want you to get that Groenfeld winding experience, which is kind of cool. And these watches are going to cost around $2,300 here in the United States. And they're coming from a brand, two brothers, who are very high-end watchmakers, but decided to make something affordable for the masses, which is pretty cool. The next brand on this list, or next brands on this list, are Carl F. Bucher and B. Swiss. You've probably never heard of B. Swiss. They make watches that are made by Carl F. Bucher. However, they are a lower end brand, a more affordable brand. They use exclusively ETA movements. I don't think they're even in business anymore. However, you can find some of their watches for very little amounts of money on the secondary market in places like eBay and Chrono24. They have the name B. Swiss on the dial. It could be the reason why they went defunct, because the name isn't all that great, but the quality is there. Carl F. Bucher make very high-end watches. They do a really good job with a lot of their watches. I feature them here on my channel on a pretty regular basis. However, B. Swiss have a very good quality as well. It's just the name recognition isn't there. B. Swiss, kind of a bad name, I would say. They made chronographs, they made dive watches, they made world timers as well. Really great watches, very, very affordable. And if you could find one on the secondary market and you don't mind that name, you can get them for a very, very good price. The next brands we're talking about are located in the Netherlands. Haltenriches make some pretty sculptural watches that get very intricate dials, some very intricate case shapes that are 3D printed. They're one of the first to do it, and a lot of their watches have very complicated cases, very complicated dials. They're really almost a work of art. They're not extremely expensive. However, their prices have been steadily going up over the past few years. They recently came out with a watch that was on the more affordable side, around $5,000, that had an automatic movement inside that was basically a Sellita or an ETA movement. They have an even cheaper brand in their belt though. They have a brand called Delft. Those watches sell for around $750. They get a standard ETA movement. They are way more standard looking than their sister brand, their more expensive brand. However, because of their structure, because of the way that they make watches and the way that they are set up, you can get a watch that costs $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 from them. They also make watches in the tens of thousands, so $10,000 or $15,000, and then $5,000 is a watch that they just recently came out with, which is, I believe, called the Ornamental. And then they have their most affordable brand, which is under a completely different brand name, and that is Delft. However, those watches are also assembled in the Netherlands using Swiss parts. However, nowhere near as good looking as the Haltenriches watches, because they put a lot more effort into those watches. They're really good looking and really well made as well. They just recently came out with a watch that the crystal actually turns dark when you go out into the sunlight. The hands sit above it, so you can still tell the time, but it's a skeletonized watch, so you cannot see the movement when it is darkened. It's really cool. And then when you go inside and the light obviously dissipates, you can see the movement again. Really cool concept, really good looking watches, and the movements on these, on their higher end watches, are obviously very, very complicated, really nice movements that are very nicely finished as well. But like I said, you can get in on this brand if you go with Delft, and they sell for around $800, somewhere in that range with the exchange rate. Good looking watches, but nowhere near as good looking as the other watches that we just showed you. Last but not least, and I could not make this list without mentioning two watches from Swatch. Of course, I'm going to mention the Moon Swatch, the Omega Swatch collaboration, and then the 50 Fathoms, or the Thrifty Fathoms, whatever you want to call it, from Omega and Blancpain. It makes a lot of sense. They are collaboration watches. However, technically Swatch making these in collaboration with those two brands They are plastic versions of very popular watches, the 50 Fathoms and the Moon Watch. These are a high-low situation. High-end brands making an affordable watch in collaboration with Swatch and using lower-end materials to make them very, very affordable for the masses. They are very popular as well. Lots of collectors, people who even collect higher-end watches, want these watches because there's a novelty to them and they look good. Even though they are cheap and they won't last a lifetime, they definitely look good. And you can own a 50 Fathoms if you want one in 42 millimeters. The Ocean of Storms, which is a watch that I actually wear pretty often. Changing the strap on these make them really great. I highly recommend them for people who are getting into watches as well, but just always keep in mind they're not going to last a lifetime. Anyway, guys, that's really my list. There was one other brand that I did want to mention here, and I will mention it now. It is Seiko. Seiko was around before Grand Seiko, before King Seiko, before the Seiko 5 collection as well. So they have spawned a lot of different collections at a lot of different price points. It's technically not the same as all the other brands that we've mentioned because these were higher end brands that came out with a more affordable watch, while Seiko were a more affordable watch that came out with a higher end brand. But with that being said, Seiko have come out with a number of other brands, including Seiko 5, which are more affordable versions of Seiko. So there's that sort of relationship too within Seiko. Tons of brands, tons of models within the structure of Seiko Epson. So there's a lot to talk about there. I actually made a separate video on that a while ago. Maybe it's something that's worth revisiting. Anyway, guys, tell me what you think down in the comments below. There are other brands out there that are related to higher end brands that have a higher end sister or brother brand, whatever you want to call it. Tell me some of the ones that you would include in a list like this if I were to make a part 2. I want to hear about those brands, so add a comment down below. Please also add a comment down below because, like I was saying in the beginning of this video, right before I gave you my first pick of this list, I've spoken to a lot of people about this, watchmakers, very close friends, about the relationship between a high-end brand and their sister, like the relationship between Groenfeld and Groan. Does that cheapen the higher end brand? Do you think it makes them look a little less expensive, a little less exclusive? What do you think? I think there are people out there that think of these brands as redheaded stepchildren. They aren't the appreciated brand. They're not the brand that people lust after. They're the cheap imitations of the higher end brands. But I don't entirely agree with that because a lot of the time they are being made under the same brand, under the same factory, a lot of the time in the same studio as their higher end brands. They're making these lower end brands at the same time. Maybe they're not using the same materials or giving you the same finishing from a watchmaker that is very high end. Maybe they're not sharing a lot of the same components, but you are getting something a little bit special. And a lot of times you will see that these watches from these brands sell for higher on the secondary market, much like their older, more expensive sister brands. Pretty cool when you think about it. Tell me what you guys think down in the comments below. I want to hear from you guys. Are these a miss or are these a hit? Tell me down in the comments below. Please also don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. It's super helpful for the channel. I very much appreciate it. Especially if you found this useful or interesting or helpful, please hit that bell icon. Anyway, guys, thank you for joining me. Thank you for watching this video. I will catch you guys in my next video.